You are listening to KLRN Radio, where liberty and reason still reign.
Hi, I'm Jay Farner, CEO of Quicken Loans, America's largest mortgage lender. Spring will be here soon, so if buying a new home is on your to-do list, right now is the time to call Quicken Loans. Learn about which mortgage options make sense for you and get a jump on your competition. With our exclusive Rate Shield approval, the low rate you lock today is protected for up to 90 days while you shop for your new home. With a Rate Shield approval, if rates go up, your low rate stays locked. But if rates go down, you get that new, even lower rate. Either way, you win. Talk to us today at 800-QUICKEN or go to rocketmortgage.com to take advantage. Here's another great reason to work with us. For a record 9 years in a row, J.D. Power has ranked Quicken Loans highest in the nation in customer satisfaction for primary mortgage origination. Again, to lock in today's low mortgage interest rate and get the security of our exclusive Rate Shield approval, call us today at 800-QUICKEN or go to rocketmortgage.com.
For J.D. Power award information, visit jdpower.com. Rate Shield approval only valid on certain 30-year fixed-rate loans. Call for cost information and conditions. Equal housing lender. License in all 50 states. NMLS number 3030.
Hi, welcome to the Subway ad for the new Sesame Ginger Glazed Chicken Signature Wrap. How would you like it?
I'll take a...
Sports announcer at home?
Yeah, how'd you...
We just know.
My wife picks up the new Signature Wrap. It's got double the rotisserie-style chicken mix with a sesame ginger glaze. She appears annoyed at me, but she shrugs it off. Those sweet and savory flavors are calling her name. She lifts the wrap and she takes the bite! Incredible! And now she's closing the door on my... Subway, make it what you want.
Limited time only at participating restaurants. Double meat based on average 6-inch sub.
I'm little teapot, short and stout.
Here is my handle and here is my spout.
No, Dad, like this. When I get all steamed up, then I shout, tip me over and pour me out.
This is WWE superstar Roman Reigns. It only takes a moment to make a moment. Take time to be a dad today.
Visit fatherhood.gov, brought to you by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the Ad Council.
KLRN Radio has advertising rates available. We have rates to fit almost any budget. Contact us at advertising@klrnradio.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Lone Conservative. Today, I have a really awesome guest on for you. I've been waiting to have this woman on one of my shows for forever. Ever since I was hosting the Schaefer Hour, I've been trying to get her on one of my programs, and she finally agreed because she's so busy, made time in her schedule. Cassie Dillon. Cassie, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure for sure.
For those of you who don't know who Cassie is, she's my boss, so I have to be extra nice to her on today's episode.
Yep.
But the issue that I had you on to discuss, and as always, I really just want to jump right into it because we talked about it a little bit beforehand, and it's a complicated issue. It's something that I really don't know that much about. I know we're going to be talking about the Kurds today, for those of you who don't know, but I know the Kurds are supposed to be our allies. I know the Kurds have a very long and nuanced history, but it's something that I feel most people don't necessarily understand. They don't understand their history. They don't understand exactly what the Kurds are. So I really wanted to get into that nuance with you and into those specifics with you today. And I wanted to start that off with the question of can you kind of go over the history of the Kurds? I know it's an extremely long 2,000-year history, but if you could kind of highlight some of the most important aspects of how we got to where we are today, where they're struggling to kind of have this sovereign nation status and they just can't get where they want to go with it.
Sure. Well, I think it's appropriate for me to back up and say that I'm an expert. Well, not an expert. I wrote a 100-page thesis. I'll say I'm an expert on Iraqi Kurds. So the Kurds are in 4 different nations. They're in Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. But I focus on the Iraqi Kurds because those are the ones that we're very allied with. The Turkish Kurds, we don't really touch them too much. We actually designated them as terrorists, their biggest political party. The Syrian Kurds, we kind of got involved with in the fight against ISIS, but still they're kind of associated with the Turkish Kurds, which we call terrorists. Some people call them freedom fighters. And the Iranian Kurds, we really don't interact with much. So I'm an expert on the Iraqi Kurds. And so, yeah, the Kurds have a very long history. They're mountain people. That's basically what they call them. The Turks actually refuse to call them Kurds and call them mountain Turks. So they have a very long history. There's about 25 to 35 million Kurds right now in the world, whether it's in the diaspora. So, living in the United States, there's actually a really big Kurdish population in Tennessee. And then they're also around those 4 countries and some of Europe. But so the Kurdish history is very long. They're a distinct ethnic group. And when I say this, I mean they have their unique language, culture, and history. The languages are kind of varied because of them being cut into different countries. They have different writing systems depending on where they are and things like that. So they're very distinct. They're also Sunni Muslims. They're not as religious as the Arab Muslims in the region. When I went to Kurdistan, I didn't have to wear a hijab. And I went to a Irish pub in the main cities in Kurdistan and danced to a guy that was playing Elvis, who was an Arab from Baghdad. So it's a melting pot in Kurdistan. So that's a little bit of the background, and we can definitely jump into more of the recent history.
Well, that's something I actually didn't know. So I thought that I know when President Trump said that he was going to pull out of the Syrian region, and most importantly, there was talks that he was going to possibly abandon the Kurds in the Turkish region. I kind of always saw Kurds as this kind of homogenous group. Like, they may have some political differentiations, but I didn't know there was that distinction between Iraqi and Syrian and Turkish Kurds. And I know you're an expert on the Iraqi Kurds, but just one specific question on the Turkish Kurds here for a second, because I know a lot of people got angry when there was a possibility that we were going to abandon them. Are they legitimately terrorists? Because I know that's how the Turkish government tries to classify them. And I know that's kind of been contested amongst conservative intelligentsia, or it was at least when the Turkish government released those statements. So what exactly is there to know about these different Kurdish ethnicities and different kind of Kurdish, I guess you could say, separations?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't call them ethnicities. I'd call them political parties. There's a lot of different Kurdish political parties, and it's like alphabet soup. You have the PKK and the PUK and the KDP and all these different ones. But when it comes to the Turkish Kurds and just the relationship between Kurds and Turkey, it's very complicated. I'm going to say that a lot, that it's very complicated, because it is. And so I'd say around the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and even beforehand, the Kurds were persecuted in some different aspects by the Turks or the Ottomans. And this included banning their language, not being allowed to speak their language or teach their children the language in schools, not being able to call themselves Kurds. Like I said earlier, they called them Mountain Turks. And so there's a lot of different tensions there, obviously. You have the Armenian genocide also going on. So the Turks really wanted a unified, secular Turkish identity. And the United States loved this. They really wanted to have more allies in the region who weren't very religious or very theocratic. And so they really did align with the Turks. And when it comes along with that, that means we're going to have the same enemies that they have. So they classified the PKK as a Kurdish terrorist organization. I forgot the year, but it was in the 1900s. And this is because they were trying to fight for their independence. So following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War I, President Woodrow Wilson had a 14-point plan. Everyone knows about this. And in it, he said the Turkish portion of the present Ottoman Empire should be assured a secure sovereignty, but other nationalities which are now under Turkish rule should be assured undoubted security of life and absolutely unmolested opportunity of autonomous development. So long story short, whoever is underneath the Ottoman Empire has the right to sovereignty. And so in 1920, there's a treaty that said that the Kurds should have independence within a year. So we're talking that the Kurds already had this nationalism and this want for identity before even the Palestinians did. Palestinians didn't have theirs until around 1967. So even before then, the Kurds were already wanting their nationality and their independence in their own state. And the state of Kurdistan, if it really did happen, it would have been in all of those 4 countries. So obviously when people are trying to get their territory in this time, they didn't want this to happen because they were going to lose it. And that's exactly what happened. The people who were going to sign on to the treaty did not allow this to happen, and it never went into actualization. So then the PKK comes into existence, and they start having wars against the Turkish government in response to the persecution. So they're blowing things up, they're killing sometimes innocent people, and they're having a complete guerrilla warfare. So that's why we classify them as a terrorist organization, and especially because Turkey is a NATO ally. We don't want to lose them. So In my opinion, I think the PUK or the PKK has done a lot of bad things, but I kind of see why they do that. And honestly, you can say that about a lot of terrorist organizations, that you can see why they did it, but you don't have to agree with it. You're like, yeah, if my family was killed by this invader or this foreign person who hates my identity, maybe you would become a crazy terrorist. But so that's what it's like with the PKK. It's very complicated.
Well, it kind of sounds a little bit like you can draw an allusion between the PKK and apartheid South Africa. When Nelson Mandela first started as an activist for equality, or against, I should say, more the white persecution that the black majority faced in South Africa. Initially, people don't know this, Nelson Mandela started as a terrorist. The group he was involved with, and he personally would be involved in terrorist attacks, would be involved in attacks on civilians, would be involved in attacks that endangered the lives of civilians. So, I mean, how it kind of sounds to me is the tactics they're using, because even Mandela later in his life, when he was all for peace and peaceful resistance, he came out and he denounced his ways, the ways of his younger self. But it kind of sounds like there is a connection here between the goal of Mandela's early days in South Africa and the PKK right now, that they're fighting what they see as an oppressor, and they're going to extremes that people really shouldn't go to in order to do that. Do you think there's hope that they abandon these tactics and they kind of have a reversal or into peaceful resistance, or do you think it's always going to be this tense relationship between the PKK and the Turkish government?
Well, I think there's two important things here, too, I need to mention about the PKK. One, they're radical socialists, like extremely radical, aligned with Russia, like very radical. The second is they're one of the biggest, they have the most influence in the region, in my opinion. They're a huge organization. And yes, they do have PKK members in Iraq and Iran and all these different places. They have a lot of influence, to the point where there's even whispers and some reports that they bailed out the Iraqi Kurds when ISIS was within 15 miles of Erbil. Erbil is the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan. So they have a lot of influence. But when it comes to them giving up their ways, I don't know. I mean, Erdogan is more focused on Islamic identity to me rather than Turkish identity. So maybe they could get wrapped up in that Islamic identity and align with them. But I'm not so sure, because the Kurds typically aren't very religious, especially if they're socialists. But that brings me to what happened in the 1950s and 60s. This is when Pan-Arabism was really starting to develop in the Middle East. Saddam Hussein was a big pusher of it. Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, they were really pushing Pan-Arabism. And this was great for the Christians in the region. The Christians are Arabs. This is wonderful for them. A lot of Christians were actually the thinkers of Pan-Arabism. And so it was really working for them. They're uniting the Middle East around secularism and just Arab identity. This was really bad for the Kurds. The Kurds were getting persecuted. The Iraqis were going into Kurdistan and torturing people and treating them awfully. And so it didn't work well for the Kurds. And then that kind of put down Kurdish nationalism for a while because they're hiding everything. And then we get to the 1990s. This is when it got really bad. This is mainly because after the Gulf War, the Kurds thought that it would be their moment to seize and have independence. So they started to kind of get ready to push for independence. And in response, Saddam Hussein appointed this guy named Ali Hassan al-Amjid, and they call him Chemical Ali. And he just started dropping chemical weapons all over the Kurds, killed 15,000 people, and really devastated the city of Halabja, which really sticks with the Kurds. They talk about Halabja all the time when I was there. They constantly brought up what happened in Halabja. And then this led to, sorry to give a history lesson, but this led to...
This is fascinating.
And then this led to, in 1991, what I would call the most successful peace operation that the United Nations, obviously headed by us, has ever done. People are always complaining about American interventionism, and while American interventionism usually sucks, this was the best thing we have ever done. And this was Operation Provide Comfort in 1991. What we did was we put a no-fly zone over Kurdistan because they all fled into the mountains, all the Kurds, because they were getting gassed to death. And so we put a no-fly zone, we enforced it twice, shot down 2 Iraqi planes, and we started airdropping in humanitarian aid. And it went so well that the Kurds eventually went back to their homes and Saddam Hussein didn't mess with them again. So that was a really, really good thing that happened. And then one last piece of horrible history. Just 2 years later, in 1993, the Kurds erupted into a civil war in Iraq, which is a common thing for them. They really don't get along with each other.
I mean, so when I hear people talk about Saddam Hussein, and I do want to get back onto talking more specifically about the Kurds in a second here, but when I hear people talking about Saddam Hussein, this is often one of the arguments that a lot of my friends who are isolationists will use. It's one of the arguments that I kind of used for a while when I was more leaning toward isolationism rather than, I guess you could say, hawkishness. But it was that even though Saddam Hussein was evil, he was a necessary evil because he was able to kind of suppress all of these rivaling factions in the Iraqi region, which helped consolidate power under himself and bring about some form of stability. But I never knew exactly how brutal it was and how brutal toward the Kurds he specifically was, and how this pan-Arabism was an ideology that would quickly turn against the Kurds. So when people say that Saddam Hussein was necessarily evil in the region, specifically now that you've spent time with Kurds and you see how they interact with each other and you see how they are as a people, do you agree with that sentiment or disagree?
Well, I think it's first important to say that during this civil war they had, there's two political parties in Kurdistan that are really prominent. There's some other ones, but they're small. The two big ones are, first, the Kurdistan Democratic Party. It was founded by Mustafa Barzani, and it stayed in his family the whole time. Think of the Kurdish parties as kind of like mafias. They stay in the family, you know? The leader of the party is always in the family. And then the next one is the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, the PUK. So KDP, PUK. PUK was founded in 1975 by Jalal Talabani, also stayed in the family, and the KDP was 1946. So KDP, PUK, those are the two different parties. And so when the civil war erupted, the KDP, you know, it's a little older, it's a little bigger, you know, they have about equal power. Right now it's a little off, but so when the civil war erupted, the KDP allowed Saddam Hussein's forces to come in and suppress the PUK. So not only are they using Saddam to take down their enemies who happen to be their brethren, but Saddam Hussein is loving this infighting. You know, they're having so much infighting, they're loving it, or he's loving it because he doesn't really have to control them. They're tearing themselves apart. And this is a really sad thing about the Kurds. The Kurds are a strong people. Their military is fearless. If you talk to some of the Americans who fought with the Kurds, they will tell you that they run towards the bullets. They're completely fearless. The Peshmerga is what they're called. And it's a really strong people, but their biggest downfall is themselves. They just cannot get along. I even saw this firsthand when I went there. I was there during elections. And we had to like take off flags off of our car and put the other flags up so we wouldn't be stopped by the rivaling political party. And you could see them hating each other. One of my security guards, who is PUK, and we had an interview with the KDP political leaders. He like went off at him at the end of our interview just to vent his beliefs. So they do not get along at all.
So that kind of brings up the interesting question that it seems as if the Kurds, they're the same people broadly, but they splinter apart with different political ideologies and different philosophical ideologies. So who does the United States, because when we hear the media talking about the Kurds, right, we only hear Kurds, broad, wholesale. But who does the U.S. specifically, which faction does the U.S. team up with the most?
I don't think we have a preference. I mean, the PUK is a little bit more socialist. The KDP is more conservative, as you would say. But I don't think we have a preference because when we team up with them, it's when they're teaming up with themselves. So when the Kurds have someone else to be mad at, they get along. So when they're getting gassed by Saddam Hussein, they're organizing things together for humanitarian efforts. And then when Saddam Hussein no longer has power over them because of our no-fly zone, they go to war with each other. And then they're trying to settle in. And then in 2003, we invade Iraq. And then the Kurds have a chance to help make the Iraqi constitution. And so in the constitution, mind you, they didn't want to be part of Iraq. So the Americans who are negotiating this are giving them a lot of concessions to convince them to stay close to Iraq because there's a lot of oil in Kurdistan. That's why Saddam was paying attention to them in the first place. And so the Constitution gave the Kurds the presidency of Iraq. So it's always guaranteed to a Kurd. And so they stay part of Iraq in 2003. And then after that, they're having a little bit of infighting. And then here comes the Islamic State in 2014. And in 2014, the Islamic State was in 14 miles of their capital. And so the Kurds are uniting around this. They're putting the PUK armies and the KDP armies together, and they're fighting against it. And towards the end of the defeat of the Islamic State in 2017, they decided to have a referendum for independence. And so this independence referendum, they tried doing it while they're united. They're fighting the Islamic State. The Iraqis could not protect them. Why be part of this country and sign on to this constitution when they can't even protect you and you have to protect yourself anyways? Might as well have your own state. And that's what they're thinking. And so they're united at this point and they're really trying to make their own state. And then it all goes awfully. And now tensions are back up there.
So let's say, I know this is all purely hypothetical, but the one thing that I have known about the Kurds for a while now, even though I didn't know all these specific factions, was that there has always been some sort of push within Kurdish territory to become a sovereign state. If they were to become, let's just say hypothetically, if they were to become a sovereign state, would you possibly have to worry about more violent infighting or a civil war in this now newly declared sovereign state? Because it sounds like they just absolutely, when they don't have a common enemy to fight, which I doubt is going to be coming from Iraq for a while, aside from maybe a terrorist organization, unless ISIS has a huge resurgence. If they don't have a common enemy to fight, it sounds like they're totally willing to fight each other. So would there be the possibility of a civil war or violent conflict if they were to somehow vote to become their own sovereign state?
I think it's possible, but I don't think that would happen until way down the road. There's two reasons for this. First of all, there's a lot of these modern parties being created in Kurdistan. A lot of young people are sick of the Barzanis and the Talibanis, and they want to make their own parties. So there's a bunch of those coming in. And then second, if there was a state of Kurdistan established in northern Iraq, where the Iraqi Kurdistan is, there'd be a lot of issues. Because if they created their own state, then who's to stop the Iranian Kurds, the Syrian Kurds, or the Turkish Kurds? Turkey is the biggest state we'd have to worry about, because if they did establish a state, Turkey would most certainly invade. There's no reason why they wouldn't, because this is going to motivate the PKK to also fight for their own state, or even go to the Iraqi state, which would, they don't want to lose that much of a population. So it'd be more likely that the PKK would try declaring their own state and attaching it on. So there'd be war. I think Turkey would absolutely go in. Turkey's also a really big trading partner of the Kurds. They have a lot of oil. They export their oil to Turkey or through Turkey out. And they actually export a lot of oil to Israel, which is a big no-no if you're part of Iraq. So it would be devastating for them. So that's why a lot of people were confused why they even had the referendum, because they're sabotaged. Like they could have sabotaged everything they had, because right now they're autonomous, and right now Iraq is also heavily controlled by Iran, and Iran doesn't want an independent Kurdish state either, especially because the Kurds have so much oil. So there's a lot of different actors in play that would prevent Kurdish independence. The only states that would even support it, Israel came out, was the only state to support the referendum. And I think the US under this administration would support the Kurds, but I don't think that would be definite if, say, we got a Democrat in power.
And, the real question when it comes down to that is they're surrounded on all sides. And despite how fearless and amazing fighters they are, I don't think they'd be able, from what I've heard of them, from you and from other people, I don't think they'd be able to take on the full brunt of an Iraqi, Iranian, Turkish invasion.
Well, the Kurds would blow the Iraqis out of the water. The Iraqis are the ones who dropped their weapons and fled out of Kirkuk. Kirkuk is a historically Kurdish town that Saddam put a bunch of Arabs in to try making an Arab town because it has so much oil. And so when ISIS invaded, this is the town that we all hear about, the Iraqi soldiers dropping their weapons and fleeing. And so they had all these American weapons from the Iraqi military, and the Kurds went and fought for that city. They actually, one Kurd called it their Jerusalem. Kirkuk was their Jerusalem. They have such historic ties to it, relating it to Israelis' feeling about Jerusalem. And they went and fought for it, and they kept it. And then the Iraqis actually threw them out of it after the referendum. So I think the Kurds, if they got into a fight with the Iraqi military, they destroy them. The problem is the Iraqi military is now being sort of substituted for Shia militias from Iran. So those guys have quite a bit of weapons, and they might be the Peshmerga.
So do you think, it's really difficult to talk about Kurdish statehood, even from the little knowledge that I have of it now because of you. So thank you for that. But it sounds like the whole idea of Kurdish statehood is impossible as long as Turkey and Iran are totally willing to invade them. You said Iran would give them issues. I'm assuming Turkey would also give them issues. Turkey
would be the biggest issue, in my opinion. If the Kurds want statehood, this is what they have to do, and it's very simple. They need to get the Talibanis and the Barzanis out of power, and that complete power, but they need to stop being, it's kind of like the Democrats and the Republicans. So picture the Democrats and the Republicans each having their own military and wanting to kill each other. Okay, that's what it's like over there. You have like KDP checkpoints and PUK checkpoints. It's completely different. And so if they really want to get statehood, they need to lesser the power of those and then have more of a parliamentary system where they have more parties coming in. And they do have a lot of parties, but they hardly have any support. When I went to Kurdistan, I went to a third party rally, and it was pretty populated. But now the leader of that party is like going to jail for corruption already. So it's only been a year since I met the guy. Now he's going to jail for corruption. So that's interesting. But first, they need to lower the power of those families. Then they need to get along. They need to unify the militaries. They need to have one economy. They need to really create some more highways connecting the two main cities of Sulaymaniyah and Erbil and try to have a united Kurdistan. And then they really need to start pushing the oil out more and having more economic development. And they do have a lot of economic development. They have foreign developers coming in. Sadly, a lot of the developers coming in are China, and China is awful for the third world. I'm sure we can talk about that in a whole nother podcast, but they just need to start uniting each other and building up their economic security. And then I think the U.S. will back them, and Turkey's not going to go against us, especially with all the tensions we have with them right now. And I would dare Iran to try going against that, especially with everything going on with Iran.
Well, Joe Chalfant, I have to give a little shout out here. Joe Chalfant, I think, actually wrote a really great piece. I believe it was for Lone Conservative, basically about China's growing influence in the African Middle Eastern region and how I think the way, I mean, from what I've heard, I think the way, and this is just a little segue, I think the way in which they've exerted influence over these regions that the United States has continued to struggle to maintain influence in has actually been really intelligent. Because how it sounds is they'll make these countries economically dependent on them, and then they can bend those countries to their will. So, yeah, China going into Kurdistan, probably not a good idea.
There were Chinese strip clubs in Kurdistan. Chinese strip clubs, which I have two things about that, okay? First, that's weird, okay? Why are there strip clubs in a Muslim country? I know the Kurds are pretty secular, but I still had to cover my ankles and my wrists just to be on the safe side. Second, what Chinese woman is willingly going to the Middle East to be a stripper? These are trafficked women, clearly. These are not women going there on their own will. So kind of sketchy that the Chinese are trafficking women into Kurdistan.
That was my immediate thought when you said that Chinese women are going to these strip clubs, is like they must be trafficked. Because also, I mean, beyond human trafficking, they're right now, Xi Jinping has been compared to a second coming of Mao Zedong in terms of all the power that he's accumulating. So it's not like individual citizens would have much of a choice if Xi Jinping has his forces come to your door one day and say, hey, you're going to Kurdistan to be a stripper. So
crazy stuff.
I don't know, man. China's a mess. But back to Kurdistan. The one thing that I wanted to ask you about is, and I know you said that the Americans haven't really been involved with this faction as much, but with our rising tensions with Iran right now, have the Iranian sect of the Kurds have we kind of been trying to grow our relationship with them? Have we been trying to have them run some sort of disruption tactics? I mean, what's going on there? Are they kind of just staying out of the conflict?
I mean, they were definitely behind some of the protests against the Khomeini government, but the thing you have to remember about them is they have also been persecuted really hard, and they kind of have their own region, and the Iranians pretty much leave them alone unless there's something going on. So I had a professor who was a professor in Kurdistan, in Iranian Kurdistan, and they randomly tried recruiting him into the intelligence services because they liked his books or something, and he didn't want to do it. And they pretty much said, we're going to kill you. And so he fled for his life, crossed into Iraq, and then he moved to the U.S. And so they do have issues in Iran with the Kurds, for sure. But I don't think it's to the level that it's going on in Turkey right now. I think the Iranian Kurds, they kind of just do their own thing, and they definitely don't want to mess around with the Americans. That's not good for them.
So something that I can imagine is an issue for the Kurds, and this is something that I've actually been wanting to talk about all episode long, and I think we've kind of given a baseline history. I know it's really simple, and if anyone wants to know more about it, make sure to follow Cassie on Twitter and make sure to pay attention to her work. But one of the things that I can imagine is really difficult for Kurds, and it's probably the only disadvantage that a democracy like the U.S. has on the foreign sphere is that we change leaders every 8 years. And with that change of 8 years max. And with that change in leadership, you could have someone who is in there for 8 years, like Trump, who is hard on the U.S. adversaries, who is really supportive of our allies in the Middle East. And then you can have someone jump in for another 8-year term or for a 4-year term who's really unsupportive. And then all of a sudden you can see a bunch of pullback in support for our allies. And that can be really confusing and also really detrimental to our allies in the Middle East. So over kind of this span where the Kurds have been one of our most consistent allies in the Middle East, how have they viewed kind of different U.S. leaders? Like, has the change from Democrat to Republican really affected them a lot?
Yes and no. So the Kurds don't like Obama, okay? Obama handed them ISIS, okay? So they don't really like Obama. But Trump, they loved Trump when I was there. There was kids named Trump. They were selling Trump hats. They had restaurants named Trump. They loved Trump. There's actually a funny video of Samantha Bee going to Kurdistan. And I don't think Samantha Bee is funny, but this video is hysterical, where she's walking around so confused why all these little kids are named Trump. So you guys should check that out if you can. It's really funny. But there's a lot. Well, first of all, they don't really like Trump anymore because Trump threatened to pull out of Syria, and that would hurt the Syrian Kurds and cause a lot of refugees going into them, and they're worried about another Islamic State. So they were mad at Trump for a while, but Ambassador Bolton kind of calmed those fears, or National Security Advisor Bolton. But there is a lot of literature and a lot of theories in international politics about negotiating with democracies. This is a really huge thing. So it could be either a positive thing or a negative thing. So say you're negotiating with a dictator, okay? And they tell you, this is what I want. I want you to do A, B, and C. And so you're negotiating as a democracy, and you can't guarantee those things. And you can use, so that they don't get mad at you, you can say, well, I don't know if my Congress will pass that. You need to give us a little bit of leeway here so I can get it passed in my Congress. So it's kind of your bargaining chip. Because if you were negotiating two democracies with each other, or two dictators with each other, you can offer whatever you want. Because you have that Congress and that public factor there, you can't really do that. So that's the positive of negotiating with democracies. And then the downside is that you change administrations a lot. So, for instance, Iran right now, Iran's just waiting it out. They're waiting for Trump to get out. They're waiting for a Democrat to come back in power. And that's why they haven't thrown away the Iran deal in its entirety, because they're just waiting for Trump to leave. Once Trump's gone, okay, Democrat here, Iran deal, we can start cheating on it again without being caught and all of that. So, yeah, those are the positives and negatives. But yeah, they definitely like Trump in Kurdistan, from at least what I've seen.
So has there, before even Trump and Obama, has there been much fluctuation between, I don't know, Bush, Clinton, H.W. Bush, Carter, Reagan?
Oh, they love George Bush, like on a whole nother level. Okay, both of the Bushes. They love the Bush family. They are obsessed with the Bush family. And this actually cracks me up a lot because my Arabic professor in college, she was a Christian Iraqi from Baghdad. Okay, and she receives a Fulbright scholarship to come to America and meet the president. And they said beforehand, okay, no pictures with the president. And she's like, good, that's probably a good thing. If I get photographed with the president, then, terrorists probably will kill my family in Baghdad. And they ended up taking a picture, and they posted the picture not only in a few magazines and a few newspapers, but also in the embassy. And so I believe it was her brother or her sister, I think it was her brother, was kidnapped. And she was actually teaching at the time at West Point, teaching Arabic, I believe, or she's teaching at some school. I think it might have been West Point. She did teach at West Point, though, and she had to call all these generals and tell them, like, my brother's been captured because you guys took a picture of me with George Bush. And so her family actually fled from Baghdad, and now they live in Kurdistan, and she's going to become a U.S. citizen soon. She's still a teacher here. She's my professor. So, yeah, she loves George Bush. Even though she is teaching at an all-women's college, a very liberal college, me and her got along great as a conservative because she understands it. She gets it.
I can't imagine she's telling too many students at this. You went to Mount Holyoke, right?
Yeah, so she teaches at Mount Holyoke and Smith College.
I can't imagine she's telling too many people there about how much she loves George Bush.
Yeah, probably not. But she does talk about how much she loves West Point, and I've seen a few students in the class get kind of uncomfortable by that.
So I guess then more on to the Kurds. I think we've actually, honestly, within a 30-minute span, Cassie, I know you were a little worried beforehand about how complicated this issue is and how confusing it can be. But I honestly think within a 30-minute span, we've covered the issue relatively well. So I kind of want to ask about like in the terms of present tense and past tense. So I kind of wanted to ask about the future for a second. And I know it gave a hypothetical earlier about what they need to do to become their own sovereign nation. But I know a lot of conservatives are often very worried about protecting our only allies in the Middle East. And when I say our only allies, I understand we have some sort of formal relationship with Saudi Arabia, but those allyships are more based on kind of mutual need over the fact that we actually like each other. And it seems like Kurdistan and the United States and Israel and the United States, beyond having mutual needs, they like each other a lot. So conservatives are worried, what can we do to maintain these allyships? What can we do to keep them well supplied and things going good for them moving forward? So what are some things that you think could be improved upon in how we deal with the Kurds? What are some things that in the future we could start to, I guess we could continue to do with them to kind of give them what they need and help keep them a good ally of the United States?
Well, first, the Kurds, how do I say this? The Kurds aren't reliable allies. They have a lot of values that they share with us, but there's still a lot of corruption there. And like I said, they hate each other. So if the Kurds really want to grow, they need to become reliable allies and do all those things I talked about earlier. And if they do become reliable allies, and also they do have a good relationship with Israel, but it's very hush-hush. They don't talk about it, obviously, because it's breaking Iraqi law. So they don't really talk about it too much. But there were a bunch of Iraq or Israeli flags flying at the Kurdish rallies. And I actually met the people who were doing it. So basically, once they become reliable allies, we can really start helping them even more. Right now, we have a military presence there, kind of training them and working with them a little bit. We also have a lot of veterans who voluntarily went and joined the Kurds fight against ISIS. I've also met a few of them. And so the Kurds also, during the fight against ISIS, they never asked for boots on the ground. There's a lot of quotes of them saying, we don't want your soldiers here. We want you to give us weapons. I saw them, and when I went on the front lines with them, they had an American tank with a Russian gun on it from the 80s. From the 80s. That's what these people are fighting with. And do you know who they're fighting against? ISIS. And ISIS has American weapons that are new. So they need weapons. And right now, ISIS is kind of defeated, so now they're facing the Shia militias, and they could still use some weapons. So I don't think it's risky to arm the Kurds. I think it's a lot better to arm the Kurds than arming all these random Syrian groups that we don't know who they are, who they're run by, and what they believe. It's much safer to just arm the Kurds, which Rand Paul actually cited quite a bit. So we want to be good allies to them. We should arm them against their enemies. Right now, they don't need that as much, but we can still help them build that infrastructure. And then also we need to invest in economic infrastructure because there's a lot of oil there and there's a lot of resources. And honestly, Kurdistan is so beautiful. They should start investing in tourism because it is one of the most beautiful places I've ever been.
So something that I didn't know that you actually brought up, and it was that China is beginning to heavily invest in Kurdistan. Do you think that possibly endangers U.S. interests in the region?
Absolutely. And this is happening all over Africa, all over the Middle East. It looks like China doesn't really have its teeth into Kurdistan as much as it does in other countries. A lot of African countries will build giant bridges for them and highways and then overcharge interest. And if they don't pay it back, okay, then this is our land now. We're going to build a military base there, yada, yada. That's the Chinese money trap. But they're not as heavily invested in Kurdistan, but they're trying to be there. So if we reinforce our relationship with Kurdistan and kind of draw these parameters saying you can't have China investing in this much of your economy, then I think they'll do better.
And do you think that would include kind of getting more U.S. investors and more industries in the U.S. to kind of go to Kurdistan and start investing there?
Yeah, but also it's risky. As an investor, do you want to invest in a country that's been war-torn for the last 20, 30 years? Probably not. But it is worth saying, when I went to those cities, these aren't little mud huts. Like, they have skyscrapers. They have Chaviland, which is like a Disneyland. Even though there's nobody there, it felt like North Korea when they brought us there. It felt like everyone walking around was like paid actors. They're all like wearing the same thing, and there's only a few of them. It was kind of weird. But Chaviland, they have an amusement park, so it's not like this third world. I mean, it is kind of third world. They have toilets in the ground, which freaks me out. I don't know if any of you guys have ever been abroad somewhere in like Asia or the Middle East. That freaks me out. How it's literally like a toilet seat, but on the ground. That was weird, but
you just squat over it, right?
You just squat over it, and then they don't use toilet paper. They have like a hose. It's really weird. Yeah, I waited all day until I went to like the Western hotels. So
good move, Cassie.
It was a weird place. But yeah, so they have infrastructure already, but investing there is risky, but I don't think it's as risky now as it was in 2014.
And then kind of the last thing that I wanted to go over before we run out of time here is that it sounds as if I know they love Bush and I know they love Trump, but it sounds as if in the grand scheme of things on this, and tell me if I'm wrong here because obviously I'm not an expert, but it sounds like in the grand scheme of things that the support Kurds receive when it varies from, Republican to Democrat, obviously varying on the individual president, but it doesn't sound like the support the Kurds receive varies all that much. It just sounds like the vocabulary and the rhetoric of the president in charge changes. So let's say Kamala Harris or Joe Biden wins over Trump. Hopefully not, but let's say they do. What sort of downturn for the Kurds could we see? Like, is there something that they're afraid that Biden and Kamala Harris would actually foreseeably take away?
So I don't think the Kurds really go by a political party. They just go for whoever is being pro-Kurd. So, I mean, the Clinton administration helped solve the civil war. So they really go by whoever is going to help them the most. I don't think they pay attention to American politics enough to know what those candidates would believe. The only candidate I think that would pose a serious threat to the Kurds would be Tulsi Gabbard, and that's because she's very anti-intervention. And like I said, I don't want boots on the ground for them, but I do want aid going to the Kurds. I think they deserve it, and I think we could make a lot of, not necessarily can make a lot of money, but I think American companies would do well in Kurdistan if they're helping out there, and I think it'd be mutually beneficial for the Kurds. So I don't think they're paying attention to it enough, and I also haven't heard any of the candidates talk about Kurdistan. Maybe Joe Biden would be worrying only because he was in the Obama administration, but it's still too early to tell, and things are really dying down in Kurdistan, so it's not really in the news.
Yeah, and I would just want to, before we end here today, I would totally support shipping more weapons over there because, even though things aren't necessarily as bad right now, the Middle East it's a whirlwind. It's 1 minute everything's calm, and then the next minute you have another ISIS popping up.
And the Shia militias are dangerous for sure.
Exactly. So I'd love to prepare them for the Shia militias and for any future conflicts that they're going to face, because another terror group is eventually going to take ISIS's place. It's more a matter of when, I would feel. But with all that being said, we've sadly run out of time. Cassie, thank you so much for coming on today. This was probably the most interesting discussion I've had on the podcast so far.
Great. I'm glad I could rehash my thesis I wrote a year ago and finally put it to some good use.
Is there anywhere, obviously, I think most people who listen to this podcast know where they can find you on social media, but one or two people maybe. So if anyone wants to hear more from you, where can they find you on social media? And are there any projects that you're working on right now that you want people to know about? So you can find me on Twitter. That's pretty much where I live and reside all day long. At Cassie Dillon. That's Cassie with a K and a Y. And there may or may not be the Cassie Dillon show coming soon. So stay tuned for that. And when it comes out, we're going to be promoting it like heck on this podcast. And I urge everyone to keep their eyes open for it. Ready for some competition. Let's see. I think I got you beat, Cassie. Let's be honest. We'll see. Number one conservative podcast in the United States versus the Cassie Dillon show. Come on. But again, thank you so much for coming on. Thanks for having me. And guys, with that, this has been this Monday's episode of The Lone Conservative. Make sure to leave a 5-star review on iTunes. Make sure to follow us on SoundCloud and give this track a like. It helps this beautiful voiced Adonis get more listeners each and every single week. So please show us your support, follow us on Twitter, and keep an eye out for Cassie's podcast. And until this Friday, have a good one, guys.